Most people are addicted to something. Not always substances. Not always anything you could name at a dinner table without making it awkward. But something. Work. Approval. Noise. Other people's problems. The endless scroll. The next thing. And the thing after that. And the thing after that. Anything that keeps the present moment full enough that there's no room left for what lives underneath it. Jung had a word for what's underneath it. He had several, actually. But the one that matters most for what we're doing today is this: the self. Not the self you perform at work. Not the self you become in an argument, or in a new relationship, or at a family dinner where everyone has agreed, silently, to be a slightly worse version of who they actually are. The self with a capital S. The integrated, total, fully realized version of a human being that Jung believed was the destination of every life, whether the person living it knew it or not. He called the journey toward it individuation, and he believed, based on decades of clinical work, of sitting across from people who were technically fine and profoundly lost, that the reason most people never complete that journey isn't lack of intelligence, or lack of opportunity, or even lack of desire. It's that the journey requires something most people find genuinely intolerable. It requires you to stop running from yourself, from the parts of yourself you've spent years learning not to look at directly, from the version of you that exists before the performance, before the persona, before the careful construction of a life designed to be legible to people whose opinion you've decided, for reasons you've probably never examined, should matter. Jung believed that every addiction, every compulsion, every pattern of avoidance is a person trying to answer a question they won't let themselves ask directly. What this video is about is that question, and why the answer, the real one, not the comfortable one, requires you to become something most people never manage. Genuinely, relentlessly, almost obsessively committed to the project of your own becoming. Jung's first great observation about the human psyche wasn't about darkness. It was about performance. He called it the persona, from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater. The persona is the face you build for the world. The version of yourself assembled from what your parents rewarded, what your peers accepted, what your culture made legible as valuable or good or safe. It's not fake, exactly, but it's curated. And over time, for most people, the curation becomes so thorough that they forget there was ever anything being curated. They become the mask. Not because they're dishonest, because adaptation is what humans do. And the persona is just adaptation taken to its logical extreme. A self so perfectly fitted to its environment that it has lost the friction that would tell you something real is being left out. Jung saw this constantly in his consulting room. Successful people, accomplished people, people who had built exactly the life they were supposed to want, who arrived at middle age and felt, beneath all of it, a specific kind of emptiness that had no obvious cause. Their life was correct. They themselves were not. What was missing wasn't achievement or love or purpose in the abstract. What was missing was the encounter with themselves, the actual, unedited, uncurated version that had been behind the persona the whole time, patient and largely ignored. This is where the addiction metaphor becomes precise, because what the persona requires in order to maintain itself is constant external input, validation, roles to fill, other people's needs to meet, structures that tell you who you are by telling you what you're for. The moment the external input stops, the job ends, the relationship shifts, the children leave, the approval dries up, the persona has nothing to sustain it, and in that silence, for the first time in years, the actual self, makes itself known, usually not gently. Jung described this as the midlife crisis, but that's become such a domesticated term that it's lost its real shape. What he was describing wasn't a man buying a sports car or a woman changing her career. He was describing a psychological rupture. The moment when everything you built around yourself to avoid being yourself stops working. When the persona cracks and what comes through the crack is everything you've been quietly abandoning for 20, 30, 40 years. That process is agonizing, and most people, rather than move toward it, redirect. They build a new persona. They find a new role. They generate new external input. They get busier. They drink more. They scroll more. They help other people with problems that aren't theirs to solve. Because helping feels purposeful, and purpose feels like meaning, and meaning feels like being okay. None of it is the same as meeting yourself. And here is what Jung observed that should land with some weight. Every strategy for avoiding that meeting has a cost. Not a moral cost, a structural one. The more energy you invest in the persona, the more distant the self becomes. And the more distant the self becomes, the louder the symptoms get. Anxiety, restlessness, the vague, persistent sense that you are slightly off from your own life, present in it, functional within it, but not quite inside it, in the way you dimly remember wanting to be. The addiction to everything except yourself isn't a character flaw. It's a very rational response to a very terrifying invitation. Jung's most famous concept, and his most misunderstood one, is the shadow. The shadow is not your dark side in the comic book sense. It's not the part of you that wants to do bad things. It is, more precisely, the repository of everything you've decided you are not. Everything that was discouraged, punished, mocked, or simply never reflected back to you as acceptable. The anger you learned to call impatience and then buried further. The ambition you were taught to disguise as helpfulness. The grief you converted into productivity. The parts of yourself that didn't fit the persona, so they went somewhere else. They went into the shadow. And here is the thing Jung kept returning to, in his clinical work and in his writing. The shadow doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It doesn't weaken. It accumulates, and it expresses itself, always, just not through the front door. It comes through in the people who irritate you most intensely, and for reasons you can't quite justify. It comes through in the patterns you swear you'll break and somehow don't. It comes through in the dreams that leave you disoriented, and the reactions that embarrass you afterward, and the choices that make no logical sense until you see what need they were secretly serving. Jung called this projection. What you cannot face in yourself, you locate in others. The man who cannot tolerate his own dishonesty becomes obsessed with the dishonesty of people around him. The woman who has never permitted herself to need anything becomes contemptuous of people who openly need things. You are not seeing them. You are seeing your own exiled material, dressed in their face. This is costly in ways that are hard to calculate cleanly, because projection means you are spending enormous energy managing something externally that can only be resolved internally. Every person who enrages you unreasonably is, in some sense, making you pay for something you haven't dealt with in yourself. Every pattern that keeps recurring in your relationships, your work, your interior life, Jung would say that pattern is the shadow's way of asking to be integrated, to be seen, to be brought back inside the whole. The addiction to yourself, in Jung's sense, means developing the willingness to do that work, to look at what irritates you and ask what it's showing you about yourself, to sit with the discomfort of recognizing parts of yourself you've spent years pretending weren't there. to stop outsourcing your interior conflicts to the people and situations around you. This is not comfortable. It was never meant to be. Jung was explicit that individuation, the process of becoming whole, of integrating the persona with the shadow and moving toward the self, is not a path toward serenity. It is a path toward completeness, and completeness includes the parts you abandoned. It includes the grief and the rage and the want and the fear that you packaged up neatly because the world made it clear those things weren't welcome. Reclaiming them is the work, and the reason most people never do it isn't weakness. It's that doing it requires you to stop finding yourself in the reflection of other people, to stop letting the world tell you who you are. And that is, for most of us, the most frightening thing imaginable, because it means taking full responsibility for the answer. The phrase sounds indulgent, self-absorbed, like something on a motivational poster that hasn't quite thought itself through. Jung would say you're confusing two very different things. There is the narcissistic self-absorption that most people recognize, the person who talks only about themselves, who processes everything through the lens of their own feelings, who mistakes their own experience for the universal one. That is, in Jungian terms, persona inflation, the ego so identified with its own story that it has no room for anything outside it. That person is not addicted to themselves. They are addicted to the performance of themselves. There is a difference. The addiction Jung is pointing toward is something quieter and far more demanding. It is the commitment to continuing to examine yourself, not to fix yourself, not to optimize yourself, but to know yourself fully, without the edits. To maintain enough contact with your own interior that you can tell the difference between what you actually want and what you've been told to want, between your genuine response to something and your conditioned response to something, between the life you're living and the life you would live if you stopped arranging it around other people's comfort. Most people cannot hold that distinction for long. It requires a kind of solitude, not physical isolation, but interior solitude. The capacity to sit with yourself without immediately generating noise, without reaching for the phone, the task, the conversation, the problem to solve. To tolerate your own company in a way that most people, if they were honest, would admit they cannot. Jung believed this capacity, what he called the capacity for introversion, not in the personality sense, but in the directional sense. The ability to move inward without flinching was the foundation of psychological maturity. Not comfort with others, not social ease, the ability to be genuinely alone with yourself and to find, in that aloneness, something worth staying with. This is why he framed individuation as a lifelong process and not a destination. You don't arrive at yourself and then stop. The self unfolds. The shadow keeps producing material. The persona keeps adapting to new environments and needing to be renegotiated. The work is not a phase. It is the orientation of an entire life. And here is what that orientation produces. Not happiness exactly. Not the uncomplicated contentment the self-help version of this promises, but something more durable. Coherence. The experience of being the same person in most situations. Of your actions matching something interior rather than always adjusting to fit what the room requires. Of your life, over time, gradually resembling what you actually are rather than what you've been willing to perform. Jung called this the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to hold opposites in tension and produce something new. The integration of everything you thought you weren't. The discovery that the parts you exiled were not weakness, but material. Not problems to solve, but dimensions of a self that was always larger than the persona you built to contain it. You were not made to live inside the persona, You were made to outgrow it. The question is whether you will commit to that outgrowing, or spend your life finding increasingly sophisticated ways to make the mask more comfortable. Jung never promised that individuation leads somewhere clean. He was honest, more honest than most of his followers have been, about the fact that meeting yourself fully is not a process that ends in peace. It ends in depth, in the capacity to hold complexity without resolving it prematurely, in the strange, uncomfortable richness of a life that belongs to you in a way that an unexamined life never quite does. But he was also clear about the alternative. The person who never does this work doesn't escape the self. They just encounter it through other means, through compulsions that arrive without warning, through the sense that the life they've built is slightly too small, slightly too tight, slightly not theirs, like wearing someone else's coat that fits well enough to go unnoticed until one day it doesn't. Through the symptoms that psychology catalogs and culture medicates, but that Jung would read differently, not as disorders, but as signals. The psyche insisting on what the person has refused to give it, which is simply attention. Honest, sustained, courageous attention to what is actually there. This is what it means to be addicted to yourself, in the way Jung intended. Not self-obsession, not navel-gazing. The refusal to outsource your interior life to the world's preferences. The commitment to keep looking, even when what you find is inconvenient, even when the persona protests, even when it would be easier, so much easier, to just keep moving and never stop long enough to hear what's underneath the movement. Most people don't make that commitment, not because they're shallow or cowardly or incapable, but because the world makes it very easy not to. The noise is always available. The distraction is always one tap away. The role is always waiting to be filled. And every time you fill it, every time you let the external define the internal, you trade a little more of the self for the temporary relief of not having to face it. Jung's question, the one this video is going to leave sitting in you, is not whether you know yourself. It's whether you've ever stopped running long enough to find out what you'd discover if you did. And whether, if you found it, you'd have the courage to call it yours.